some attendees that are going to be on the webinar. If you're joining us via the webinar link, you have access to the chat and the question and answers. So if you do have a question that comes up, please go ahead and post the question in the question and answer box that you have on your window. And we'll also be taking some questions from Facebook Live via comments, so please feel free to do so there. Mike, if you also want to have your team take off of our stream, if you'd like, that's I think you can go ahead and do that if you want to tell your Facebook social media folks if they want to do that.
Yeah, I'm not logged into it. I kind of let Naveed and his team handle all that.
Okay, all right. So we'll just give just another minute or so, and then we'll get started. But thank you, everyone, for joining us. I think we're just waiting for Luis Aguilar to join us from CASA. I want to make sure that I'm seeing the live stream so that I can see the comments. Okay. And we have an attendee that has a question. Please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A box. That is, you can click on the Q&A and type your question there, and we'll be able to see those questions. Welcome, Luis. You're good? Okay. All right, so I think we should get started. We have everybody on. What I do ask for our panelists, if you don't mind, while you're not speaking, to please mute so that we don't get any feedback on the mics, and that would be awesome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening for a very important discussion that, in light of what has been going on in our country, we've been going through some major changes in our society and in our community and communities. And some of those issues are issues that are longstanding issues that we've been trying to work on, and some issues are issues that we may have not been aware of until they are literally brought before us, and we have to begin to deal with them. We felt this issue was important to bring up post, what happened in Minnesota, the murder of George Floyd, and some of the issues that we've been having here in the county, and a discussion that we felt was necessary. And this actually started with the help of one of our team leaders, Fazia Dean, our Deputy Outreach Director. Fazia actually reached out to Supervisor Gross and reached out to Mr. Schott, and she said, well, let's do this. And I said, well, let's have this as a much larger conversation. Let's go ahead and bring in our friends and our fellow community members at the NAACP at CASA, so that we can have a community conversation and think about how we as a community can come together and try to resolve some of the most difficult problems that exist in our society, and talk about how we can do better together as a community so that we can make sure that people feel safe and secure. So I'm going to frame this in the sense that, some data recently came out regarding our own police department. Chief Rossler, who I've had personal dealings with in the past, and is a great guy, has been working very hard to increase the diversity in the county police and has put in some programs to do so. But there's still some issues that exist that I think we need to work on as a community and as a county, particularly when we see some of the data that came out most recently regarding arrests. When we look at, for example, the arrest data, I'll just pick one district, Providence District, so that Supervisor Gross doesn't get mad at me. It's not Mason District. Providence District. But if you look at Providence District, the African-American population in Providence District doesn't exceed 7%, but the arrests were almost at 50% of African-Americans in Providence District. And that there's something that's askew there. And that data actually carries across other districts in the county, and it's a county-wide phenomena, and that's problematic. So the other element that I want us to address as we get through this is I've been told some of our community members who have had interactions that were less than favorable with some of our police officers. And unfortunately, many times when you have an interaction with a police officer, it's usually in a very difficult circumstance, right? It's either you're getting a ticket for some speeding or other thing, or something a little bit more difficult than that, whether it be an arrest or whatever it be. But we've had interactions that were not those, and yet our community members felt that they did not receive, professional treatment in some circumstances. I'll tell one story, and then I will turn it over to some of my colleagues, and we'll then turn it over and to Supervisor Gross and to Mr. Schott and get the conversation going. But one story that one community member, when we announced this, came up to me and told me, as you all know, we've got several prayers at the mosque. The latest prayer happens anywhere, sometimes between 8:30, sometimes 10 p.m. One of our community members was driving, literally leaving the mosque at night, driving just his regular car, and this mosque attendee, I know personally for many years. He is actually a highly rated a PhD from Princeton University, and works in one of the high-tech fields in our community, and was driving, got pulled over by one of our police officers right off Route 7 as he made the turn from Rose Street. And the police officer basically pulled him over, and she didn't tell him right away why she pulled him over, but she asked, "Can I search your car?" And he said, "No, why would you want to search my car?" So she said, "Okay, wait." And she called in a canine unit, and the canine unit did a roundabout, and of course, she told him, "Well, the canine hit on your car, we're going to search your car." And he had to wait for 2 hours at the side of the road, and while the police actually went through all of the car, of course, nothing was found. And then he was given a ticket for those air freshener trees that hang from, the rear view mirror. So this is one story, and I've heard several others. And the problem that happens is our community doesn't know where to report this and how to deal with something like this. So people just end up having feelings and not being able to express, and just begin to create negative feelings towards our police because of interactions like that. So that's just one story, and I'm going to turn it over to Mike Woltz to mention, what NAACP is working on, and then we'll go to Luis thereafter, and then we'll have Supervisor Gross address us.
Thank you, Saif. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. My name is Mike Woltz, and I'm the chair of the Legal Redress Committee for the NAACP's Fairfax branch. And Penny, I don't know if you remember, there was a meeting a few years ago. Well, you have a lot of meetings, so I don't know if you remember, but there was a meeting with PTA presidents about funding for education, because Virginia has some funny rules that make it a little difficult for us to earn money. And I remember you saying that at that time, I was PTA president of Weyanoke, and you had shared with me that you were as well. So we have that commonality, and that was really the beginning of my advocacy journey. Since then, I've become involved in school boards, citizen advisory committees, the Northern Virginia District PTA, and most recently the NAACP. And I'll briefly just share the story that I take a lot of complaints. People file a lot of complaints, and I'll talk to them and kind of get from them what transpired. And there was a father who had a 17-year-old son and an 18-year-old friend. They were out at a strip mall, and the police stopped them to ask them some questions in relation to an attempted robbery. And the 17-year-old identified himself as a minor, letting the police know, you contact my parents. And, the officer said, "No, you're okay," and continued to question them, and took this picture. And when the kids were kind of shook up for a while, so after the police left, called their parents, and I think their parents either came out or they just made it home a lot later. Excuse me. And what was frustrating for the family, besides that incident alone, is that the police have not established a clear chain of custody for what happened to that picture of their son. Because suppose something else happens and that's now used in a lineup or as a suspect. And I don't think they got a real responsive or collaborative, you know, they did not get any communication with the police in a productive way. And again, they were 10 minutes away, so really all they had to do was just give a call, and parents would have come out. But so there's the violation of the young man's rights, and while that's not, fortunately, nothing happened to them. There was no need for it. It was really simple, and every violation or act of misconduct does not have to result in somebody dying, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be watching over it anyway. Saif, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Luis, go ahead.
Thank you, Saif. First and foremost, thank you for the invitation. Luis Aguilar, Virginia Director for CASA, and glad to be here with great company. If we're talking about stories about what happens between the interaction between community members and police, I think I can speak on behalf of the organization. But actually, I want to go back in time, at least for me, and then for CASA. CASA is an immigrant rights organization. We're a nonprofit as well, in which we provide services. We do community organizing and advocacy as well to improve communities of color and low-income communities' lives. And when I say I want to go back in time, I want to go back in time actually when I used to live here in Mason District. When I used to live in Coolmore growing up, way before I was involved in any advocacy, I was actually living in Coolmore, and I think more than anything, what ends up happening not only with my community, within the immigrant community, is those lived experiences really change your life. There was police presence in Coolmore is, for example, one of the things that becomes normalized for immigrants. Unfortunately, one of the occasions that I have had to interact with the police was when one of my upstairs neighbors was talking to his little brother, and he happened to hand them the keys. He literally tossed them the keys to him, and his brother went upstairs. The police were doing a roundabout. They stopped. No less than 7 officers came in, threw my neighbor down on the floor. The mother had a seizure when she was witnessing this. This was several years ago. This was about maybe 7 years ago. And when this happened, I recommended to my neighbor. Again, back then I was not as involved within this type of work, but I recommended to my neighbor, you should make a complaint of this. What ended up happening is that I saw the complete opposite from the police department. I saw no less than 10 officers come outside, because we lived in the same apartment complex, come outside and intimidate almost daily. They would step in and they would come in and they would get in the young man's face and they would say, "We're just checking on you, that you're doing well. We're just checking on you." And if you can imagine what that creates, what type of interaction that happens there, what kind of distrust, disregard the immigrant policies that affect us at the federal level. When there is this type of approach at policing, it creates a huge mistrust. When we're looking at young brown and black kids as potential criminals, it creates this atmosphere. Another occasion is when I witnessed several young kids in Coolmore being stopped, and being stopped and frisked, quite honestly, and they were placed with plastic bands. And then I went and I looked at what was going on, and I took pictures of this. Again, it was around the same time frame. What the police do, they come up to me and they would take pictures of me right in my spot. Again, I do because I always have to be cautious, especially now within the role that I represent. Throughout time, I've also had other types of interactions with the police. Just like when there was a murder right around the corner of where I live, likewise as well within Coolmore, the police came in and actually were asking whether we had any video footage, because I used to have a video camera there. And so that is a different type of interaction that I would think is the most normal type of interaction rather than the previous ones. And so I highlight these stories because, yes, we need to hold, just like we aim to hold elected officials accountable to make sure that they truly represent their constituents. I truly hope that we do the same with police, the police department and police officers, because at the end of the day, yes, they are public employees. But I will end with saying this: while I share those stories, we can also look at the statistics. Unfortunately, the demographical statistics here in Fairfax County don't paint that full picture, because when a Latino is stopped, they're either tagged as white or black, and so we need to redo and actually invest at the state level so that that happens amongst other localities. And we'll talk more about that later, but that's something that I wanted to bring up. And thank you.
Thank you, Luis. I think the state police and FBI is changing that issue regarding Hispanic or Latino as I was reading, but we can ask maybe Mr. Schott about that if he has any idea. So you know, one of the things that I just got finished reading Malcolm Gladwell's Talking to Strangers. I don't know if you all have read that book or not, but one of the things that he comes to as a conclusion is, we can either approach each other with, a way of doubting one another, or we can approach with good intention, right? And he says in his conclusion that unless we as a society focus on the good intention, we're going to have very difficult interactions between strangers, and that actually applies to the way that we need to think about community policing as we move forward. Those good intentions of dealing with one another, particularly with the police, making sure to have the positive interactions with the community versus the negative. I'm going to ask Supervisor Gross to talk a little bit about what the board has been thinking about and kind of ideas post what's been going on since George Floyd. And then we'll move over to Mr. Schott, and he'll tell us about the police auditor and the role versus the civilian review panel.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody for putting this review together. I really want to start longer ago than more recent issues that happened after George Floyd's death. Couple of things. First of all, you never want to ignore an opportunity to partner with others to resolve issues, and I think this is a good step in collaboration. I also want to say something to Mike. Mike, PTA is a really good stepping stone to public service and advocacy, and so I'm delighted to see you again, and also want to encourage anybody who is listening in or participating in this meeting to remember that PTA, civic associations, various nonprofit organizations, faith communities, and so on, that's all part of our community that can work really, really well together. Yes, we have differences, but those differences pale in comparison to the commonalities that we all share. So I really want to make an effort to get more folks involved in their community, not just in a single portion of the community, but look at all the places where you touch, and that's really important. I also want to tell you a little bit about it personally. It wasn't actually a personal experience of mine. It was of my daughter, my grown daughter, but this was a number of years ago. She was in college. Had recently been elected. She got stopped in downtown Annandale. I think it was a traffic issue. And she said to the officer, "Well, my mother is Penny Gross." And the officer said, "I don't care who your mother is." And she got a ticket, which is exactly the way the police should have done. They should never have said, "Well, that's okay. You go on ahead." No, they reacted just exactly the way they should. And I told her, don't ever try and use your mother as the reason for not doing something. She has to stand on her own 2 feet. She can't use mine.
Especially in Mason District.
Especially in Mason District. Back in 2013, we had a police-involved shooting. of a Caucasian man, and by I believe the officer was perhaps of Hispanic background, but I'm not absolutely sure. His name was Hispanic, but that doesn't necessarily mean he was. Um, and he ended up being charged in this particular case for shooting this man and killing him. And it was the first time that the police actually had been a police officer actually had been indicted and went through the court system. I believe Richard, if I'm not mistaken, he pleaded guilty to that
Yes,
particular charge. Finally, yes, okay. And
Actually,
did
it's a
serve
lesser charge, manslaughter, I believe.
manslaughter. Okay. But that was the catalyst. That particular shooting was the catalyst for the board of supervisors putting together a full-blown effort to have the police executive called PERF. It's Police Executive
Research
Forum. Thank you, Richard. And they did an overall review of the police department's policies and use of force. Out of that PERF review came over 200 recommendations, of which about 180 were implemented, including an ad hoc police group, plus our citizen review panel, and the hiring of an independent police auditor. This took several years. It took a lot of resources, and we are still working on some of those recommendations. But it made a huge change in what we do in Fairfax County and who is involved in some of these complaints. It actually helped, I think, a great deal take care of some of the complaints, have the police department investigate them, have the citizen review panel look at them. It's done. I think we were way ahead of the game. Is really what I want to say, as far as examining internally what we do in Fairfax County. One of the things that also we have done, of course, is body-worn cameras. We did the pilot project. Mason District was one of the 3 stations that had the pilot. Worked very, very well. There was reluctance on some parts, on some police officers to do the body-worn cameras, but I think overall it was agreed that it was a good thing, and we actually had additional money in the budget this spring to expand our police body-worn cameras to more officers, but we had to remove that funding because of COVID-19. We did not remove the item. We did not remove the impetus. We did not remove the promise. We just had to remove the money. And we do anticipate that we will be able to broaden that. Police body-worn cameras work very well. They're very effective. However, they're also very expensive, and it's not the camera that's expensive. That's the least part of it. The expensive part of it, and Mr. Schott can probably go into greater detail about the legal side. All that footage, every bit of it, has to be reviewed by someone an attorney in the county, in the Commonwealth Attorney's Office, and then we have to find some place to store all of that footage, even if it's in the cloud. You have to have storage, and so the real expense is personnel to review and the storage, and still the law has not really caught up with that. We're reliant on state law for some of that. The issue came up about where to report issues and complaints. I think some of what we've done with the review, the police review panel has helped, but there are many ways of making complaints. People complain to me, I send it on. I don't get involved in the complaint. That's not my role. But if I get a complaint from somebody who complains about something that happened with the police, it goes directly I send it to the chief so that he can put it into whatever internal processes needs to be done. Also wanted to mention that we do have a public safety committee of the board. All members of the board, it's a committee of the whole, so all members of the board are members. We meet on a regular basis. Our agendas are always too full. And the new chair of Public Safety Committee is Rodney Lusk, one of our new board members from the Lee District, who happens to be African American. Rodney is getting his feet under him as the chair of the Public Safety Committee, but we have not slowed down in the transition from the former chairman to the new chairman, not slowed down at all. The thing that has slowed us down on some things is COVID-19. So with that, I want to assure everybody we are working constantly to improve what we do in Fairfax County on many levels, but especially we're aware of the issues between the police, members of the police force, and the community. We started community policing almost 25 years ago. It's been very effective. It's not been perfect, perhaps, from a number of angles. It never will be perfect, I don't think. But the police officers really recognize and understand the need to be out in the community and to get to know people in the community. I was talking to an officer yesterday about some issues in Annandale, and he said, we are there often enough that we know people by their names. And these are not people that they would be arresting. These are people that they would be just chatting with about how their kids are doing, what's going on in the apartment complex, and so forth. So there's a lot of community policing going on that's very positive. The problems that we've heard from make me sad because I think we are all trying to do the right thing, but we're also all human beings, and we sometimes have to remember that. So with that, I will be happy to let somebody else talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Gross. I think what we'll do is, so keep your questions coming in. We do have questions coming in, but I want to turn it over to Mr. Schott to talk about what his role is as the independent police auditor and how that role differs from the civilian review panel that was created, I think, 4 years ago or so, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
I know Steve Descano was on that, if I'm not mistaken, before he became Commonwealth Attorney.
That's my recommendation.
There you go. So, Mr. Schott.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, thank you for the invitation to participate tonight, and to everyone for being here. If it's okay, before I kind of align my responsibilities against the civilian review panel, I heard a lot of things that I would like to go back and address while they're fresh in my mind. The stories that I heard, the individual stories, those are very concerning, as Supervisor Gross said. That shouldn't be happening. Hopefully, it's not happening as frequently as it may have been happening years ago, but don't misunderstand what I'm saying. One incident like that is too many. One thing that a lot of people don't realize or consider when you hear a story like that, a big push in law enforcement right now to include Fairfax County is not only to hire, to maintain the number of officers that are in a police force, but to increase the diversity of the police force. And when you hear a story about, a situation like Luis described, you're totally being counterproductive to any type of recruitment efforts in the Latino or Hispanic or the African American population. It's very, very counterproductive on many levels. Again, if I don't forget, I would like to finish up at the end of my discussion talking about the statistical collection of data and what is currently being done. But I will go back and kind of piggyback on Supervisor Gross's lead into what created this position. After the ad hoc commission was convened following the John Gear shooting, they came out with their over 200 recommendations. Two of those recommendations was the creation of an independent police auditor and the civilian review panel. So from a big picture standpoint, we, the auditor and the panel, we're both part of what's called civilian oversight of law enforcement. And I'm going to show my ignorance here. I didn't realize until I learned about this position that there is a national organization called NACOL, which stands for the National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. We have become very involved with NACOL over the past several years. I bring them up because when I learned about them and learned much more about civilian oversight, I learned that approximately 150 police agencies in the United States has one form or another or both types of oversight, about 150, which, if that doesn't sound like a whole lot of agencies, it isn't, because many people that I talk to don't realize that between federal, state, and local law enforcement, there are over 18,000 law enforcement in this country. 18,000, and approximately 150 have any form of oversight. When the board here took their action, I always refer to it as they jumped into the pool with both feet and created the civilian review panel and the independent police auditor. Very few jurisdictions have this type of hybrid approach. Most of the 150 have one or the other, but not both. So with that lead in, what is it that I do? What is it that the panel does? And why did the board see the need to create both back in 2016? My position was created to review investigations of death or serious injury cases involving the Fairfax County Police Department. And let me just pause for a minute. Death or serious injury while in the custody of the Fairfax County Police Department. That's important, I think, for two reasons. The first is it may or may not involve the use of force. You could be transporting someone upon whom no force was used, and that person suffers a medical situation in the back of a patrol cruiser and dies. We have an in-custody death. Most people assume that when I mentioned that category of review for death or serious injury, it was the result of some type of a use of force. And that's probably what would generate most of these investigations, but not all. The second important thing to consider here is the individual must have died or sustained serious injury while in the custody of the Fairfax County Police Department, as opposed to the Fairfax County Sheriff's Department. And essentially a handoff is made following an arrest and an appearance before a magistrate. And the handoff is from the police department to the sheriff's department at the adult detention center. If something were to occur, and tragically there have been some occurrences that many people are familiar with, if an incident occurs after that handoff and the person is in the custody of the sheriff's department, and an incident leads to their death, that is not something that I, as the auditor, have any ability to review. But what a lot of people don't realize is the criminal investigation of the death or the circumstances leading to the death will be conducted by the Fairfax County Police Department's Major Crimes Bureau. So there is some involvement, but I would have no involvement. The other incidents that I review is any use of force, whether it result in any injury, serious injury, or death, if a complaint is made by a member of the public. And I want to highlight a couple of things there because it comes back to the incidents that several of you described earlier. before 2017, if a person wanted to make a complaint about a police officer, they could go to their supervisor, like Supervisor Gross or Chairman McKay's office, but they and the supervisor really had no other person or office to turn to than the police department. And that's an intimidating thing to ask somebody, we're going to refer your complaint to the police department, even though it's about a police officer, so that they can review it. And that could discourage many people, as I'm sure we can all understand. Now, for what it's worth, the person can make a complaint directly to me, my office, which would either be reviewed ultimately by me or the panel. And I know I haven't talked about the panel yet. For good or bad, and I'm very upfront about this when people come directly to me to make a complaint, neither I nor the panel has any investigative authority. We are mandated still to turn that complaint over to the police department for the investigation. So
hold on, I want you to repeat that again. So
yes.
If someone comes and complains to you and
Yes.
says this has happened, what's the process? What happens next?
So I get a complaint. Well, and again, let me back up. I say I get a complaint. I'm a paid full-time employee of the county. The panel is made up of 9 purely civilian volunteers. They are not paid. They do not have an office. They are not full-time, although in the past several months, I think some would argue that they are almost full-time. But I mention that because my office, and I have 2 staff persons who work for me in my office, a complaint, whether it is going to be reviewed ultimately by me because it involves the use of force, or could be reviewed ultimately by the panel, is going to initially be made with me. And mechanically, if you go to the Civilian Review Panel's website and you want to lodge a complaint, if you want to do it over the phone number listed for the panel is actually my phone number. So I'm basically the intake person for the panel. I don't try to influence what the person is saying, how they want to proceed. I simply take the information, or my staff member will, and it's immediately shared with the police department and the Civilian Review Panel so that they're aware of it. And the police department knows that the panel is aware of this complaint.
And then what happens?
Yeah, that doesn't change the fact that the police department conducts the investigation. And Supervisor Gross can elaborate more. At the time of the creation of the panel and the auditor, there was conflicting interpretations of state law, but the way the county interpreted it, and I was not involved in this, was that based on what the Virginia State Legislature has propounded, the County Board of Supervisors did not have the authority to bestow investigative powers on entities like a civilian review panel. I mentioned that, and I'm being very long-winded. That is my understanding anyway. That is something that the Virginia House of Delegates and the special session is going to consider literally next week during the special session. The changing state law to give local governing bodies the authority, if they choose to, the authority for independent bodies such as the Civilian Review Panel or the Independent Police Auditor to investigate rather than merely review completed investigations.
So essentially, Mr. Schott, what you're saying is this is something that we should be taking up with the delegates, or our board should be working with the delegates to have some sort of legislation to give these panels some teeth or investigative powers. Because what you're saying is essentially it comes to you, but then it goes back to the police, for an investigation.
Yes.
I think that's something that people might see as problematic.
Yes.
But if you don't mind, I want to get to some of the questions that we've already started having coming in.
If I can just follow that up with 30 seconds.
Yeah, go for it.
I appreciate your concern and your comment. Supervisor Lusk, the new chair of the Public Safety Committee, he's very, very well aware of this issue, and my understanding is he has at least broached it with the Board of Supervisors on an individual basis, and I think it will be addressed by the Fairfax County delegation at next week's session. I don't know.
Supervisor Gross, did you want to say something?
Well, I was just going to say we have to be a little careful here because, first of all, the board has not really discussed what might be happening in this special session because it came up, after we've gone into hiatus for the next month or so. But we do have to be a little careful. I've always said, be careful what you wish for with the Virginia General Assembly, because you may end up with something that you just either isn't workable or you really didn't want. I chair the personnel committee for the board. I've chaired it for many, 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 many years. I am mindful that all the police officers are county employees. There is a protection of their personnel under personnel, so we have to be very careful that whatever legislation comes out of the General Assembly, if there is any, and it would have to be emergency legislation, I guess, because unless they just did it and then waited to ratify it until the regular session in January. But I would be very careful about exposing, if you will, personnel information that currently is protected, because that is something, when you are a county employee, you do have civil service protection, and that is one of the things that is very serious. So personnel issues are protected from release in most cases, and that would be a sea change for county employees that they're not prepared for. So I think we have to be mindful of what the ripple effect might be of wanting one thing and then finding out that it doesn't work because of a whole lot of other things, or it affects a whole lot of other things that also would need to be changed.
So Supervisor Gross, I'm going to take the questions, but I think pushing back a little bit on that, one of the concerns I had after the Commonwealth Attorney decided to charge the police officer recently in the use of force, and I know it's ongoing, so you're not going to address it, but on a larger macro level, one of the concerns I had was I read that many police officers were very angry at Colonel Rossler. And this is press, but that they were angry at Colonel Rossler for essentially allowing or kind of taking this issue to the Commonwealth's attorney. That is also problematic in the sense that when if the police chief feels like something is wrong and the Commonwealth's attorney is doing something about it, and yet our police feel like that is abandoning them, then there's a disconnect between what the community is feeling and what our police are feeling. And I think that's something that we really need to start thinking about and addressing as a community. And I'm not saying this is not about attacking the police. This is about figuring out as a community how we deal with these types of situations, while also making sure that the protections that you talk about in terms of civil service protection are in place.
I think the challenge, and I can't speak a whole lot about the incident, but I think the challenge for most of our police officers, and many of us actually have been in the county for a long time, was that there were certainly the Commonwealth attorney can level a charge. Absolutely, that's one of the things they can do. However, some of the statements that were made, perhaps, were done before there was any investigation investigation at all. And that's where I think the disconnect was, perhaps between the chief and many of the police officers, was that there was no investigation. There was none of that sort of timeout for the investigation before public comments were made, and that's the challenge here. Um, it was an emotional time. It was, you have to be careful when you are a public official, because everything you say gets parsed down to the nearest comma. And so, but I think that is the challenge here for this particular incident, is that there was no the investigation hadn't started, and public comments were being made by leaders, and you have to be careful about that.
So we had a question that came in for Mr. Schott. Is there anything in the current use of force policy that you or the civilian review panel have noticed that needs improvement and has not been addressed by the chief? On another note, Fairfax County Police has a current ban on chokeholds, but does the ban apply to a case when the police officer objectively, reasonably believes it is a deadly force situation?
I've done a pretty thorough review of the entire use of force policy, which is not a standalone. The use of force policy is actually about 60 pages long and tries to address as many situation possibilities as you can imagine. I've made a handful of recommendations since I've been in my position. I think one or two that had anything to do with the use of force policy. I made some on their search warrant procedures, but let me back up, because Supervisor Gross indicated when PERF, the national organization, the Police Executive Research Forum, did that comprehensive review of all of the police department's policies, they really drilled down on the use of force policy. So it's considered best practice, and I'm not a huge fan of that term, but that is kind of the common term for policies and procedures. It is considered best practice. Is it perfect? Probably not, but I don't know that there is a perfect policy. As far as the chokeholds, the way the provision reads, and please don't quote me on this, I don't have it in front of me. The policy does ban all chokeholds as well as carotid restraints, which is slightly different than a chokehold. But what it does indicate is that they are not authorized techniques of the department, which I think allows for, if you are in a deadly force situation, you could attempt to save your life or the life of someone else to use some kind of a neck hold. But the way the policy reads now is it is not an authorized technique of the department.
I could ask, and maybe this is something that could be also provided after. I think one thing that will help a lot of people is just get a greater understanding of how these auditory review processes work and they function. I think a lot of people aren't very familiar with civilian review panels, much less an independent police auditor. So, Mr. Schott, if you don't mind, and this is more of a question, I'm going to ask two questions, one to you and one to Supervisor Gross. Who audits you? Like, who does oversight on the work that you do? Because even though you're turning it over to the police, you still don't know who is keeping, a check on what you're putting together to evaluate it and assess it and do any follow-up necessarily. And Supervisor Gross, maybe it needs more explanation, but I was concerned about it sounds like a shield, almost like an immunity shield for police because they're civil service employees. And the difference between what they're able to do and, say, an electrical inspector is maybe they don't inspect something right and somebody doesn't pay the right zoning fee, or something's not laid the right way, but usually nobody dies. And the only civil servant that has the authority, legal authority to kill somebody is a police officer. So if you can help me understand, can there be anything done, especially in light of that very special legal right that they have and unique legal right, that some type of can pierce some of what seems to be an immunity that they have for liability for their actions, because no other person in the carrying out of their duties is authorized to kill.
Well, I think that the situation with the John Deere shooting probably is a good example of a police officer who was charged with crime and was adjudicated. They could have, I'm not sure, I guess with a criminal charge, I don't think you can breathe a criminal charge to the Civil Service Commission, but we have structures in place that make us, that we have to follow certain rules. And I understand people think that the police, have immunity. No, it's we have structures that, and I was talking only of the personnel piece that from a civil service perspective, it's not that you can't be charged. It's that certain information cannot be released without going through a process. And that's my concern, is that folks want a whole lot of stuff released that is actually protected by civil service protection, which is a structure that deals with all of our employees. Whether you are a zoning inspector who did something wrong, we have a full, again, a volunteer group of citizens who sit on the Civil Service Commission, and they hear those grievances, and sometimes the grievances end up with an admonishment. Sometimes it's with a firing, but those are civil service. If you're charged with a crime, it's going to be different. But my concern was the personnel information. I mean, sometimes people want to know. They want to know where they live, what their phone numbers are, who their kids are, all this kind of stuff. And people need to be, there's some information that should not be released.
So it's disclosure of information. It's not that there's no process to hold them accountable. Is that
sorry?
It's disclosure of information that is sensitive and has to be protected. It's not that there's no structure to hold them accountable, regardless. And murder.
That's right. That's right. We have structures. I just wanted to make sure that people understood that anybody who works for the county, any county employee, except for me and my colleagues and our staffs, our supervisor staffs, everybody else is covered by the civil service protection. Those of us who are in an elective office or those who work for they are considered political appointees, so they can be hired and fired at will. But I also wanted to mention the civilian review panel. Richard, I don't think this is something that you mentioned. When we set it up, and you had mentioned the hybrid system, and in Fairfax County, we do like to do belts and suspenders for a lot of things. We set up the qualifications for people to serve on the civilian review panel. You can set me right if I'm not saying this correctly, Richard. You cannot be a current or former member of the Fairfax County Police Department and serve on the panel.
Yes.
So that immediately gets even though people have some expertise, they cannot serve on the panel.
Nor can you have a relative.
That's right, nor can you have a relative. And quite frankly, Mr. Schott came to us from outside the county. When we set up these positions, I was on the interview panel. We interviewed several people. He was clearly the best of the selection, and actually, I think it's such a big job. I think we scared some people away from continuing the interview process. But it has worked well. I think it has worked perhaps better than we anticipated. The start wasn't as rocky as I think we thought it might be, but Mr. Schott was very good about sort of going with the flow, understanding that we had set this whole new position up. There were no rules about it. We said, you're it. Set up the structure. Set up the how you're going to handle this, and he's done a very good job. We're very, very, very fortunate in Fairfax County to have him.
And if I may, Mike, I'll return to your initial questions, but I'm glad Supervisor Gross addressed that concern about the accountability. Maybe using a real example could help, and it will answer one of your first questions, and that was, what is the procedure of an audit or a review by the panel? The panel, being a public body, whenever there are 3 or more of the panel members gathered, that's a public meeting by Virginia state law. The Freedom of Information Act requires that that meeting be noticed and, if not mechanically recorded, at least a summary of the meeting be prepared and shared with the public. That's important because when, I've already indicated, neither I nor the panel can investigate, we review the completed investigations. From the panel's perspective, they conduct a review that mechanically, the way it works, each individual member will go to the police department's Internal Affairs Bureau office and individually review the entire investigation, to include the subject officer's personnel information, which is protected. They sign a confidentiality agreement. They are empowered to review it. And after all 9 have reviewed the entire investigation, they now converse and discuss the investigation at a public meeting. But if any information that is protected, whether it be personnel information or private information contained in that personnel file, or even the discipline that may have been meted out after a policy violation, if they're to discuss any of that, they have to go into closed session from the public meeting and then discuss it in private, where there is no recording, there's no one other than their attorney and the members of the panel. Then they come back and they return to the public part of that public meeting. So they have been entitled to review it, but they are not entitled to disclose it. That is a very important feature. And now the easy part, to whom do I answer? I answer to Supervisor Gross and the other 9 members of the board. And that is a very good question, actually. Why the term independent police auditor? I am independent from the police department. I answer not to Chief Rossler, but to the Board of Supervisors, and also, I think, by nature of the job, to the public. And what I mean by that is, upon completion of any review that I conduct, and this also applies to the panel, I must publish a public report, and I do so by virtue of putting it to the Independent Police Auditor website. I share those with, to make it easy, directly with the board, so they can see them and review them at their leisure. Share that with the chief, and then it goes. It's also on the public website. So if anybody has a complaint or a criticism or a disagreement, they can certainly. They have, in fact, taken it up directly with me, and I've had very cordial conversations with people who have disagreed, or if they feel strongly enough, they could certainly go to a board member and lodge a complaint about my finding. And they
could you put the website in the chat, Mr. Schott, so people could have it? And I think Luis had a question.
Good, sure.
I could just add to what Richard said. His reports are excellent. I look at it from a layperson. I've been around the police department for a long time, but I don't necessarily follow every little piece. And his reports are very readable. There's some legalese in them, absolutely. He is they're thorough, and by the end of the report, you can sort of, even if you don't look at the final determination, you can sort of figure by going through, you understand how those various things might have happened and what may have been done correctly, what may have not been done correctly. They're all published online. You can read every single one of them, plus the annual report that he does. I find them fascinating. I read them from beginning to end every time because I learn something each time a little bit more about what police procedures might be and how they might be improved. Because it's not just what happened and how it was handled. He always makes recommendations for improvement or says why he's not making a recommendation for anything.
I want to take kind of a measurement of at least what CASA and what we're hearing from the community. I think this panel is it's a very clear indicator, for example, of that disconnect within the community. And when we're talking about the police, I think we're talking a lot about education towards the general public about what the civilian review panel does or the independent police auditor. And while education, I think it's critical and important, when there's mechanisms and structures that are not working, I think that is when we get the sentiment from the community and what we're experiencing. And then I'm going to put this into context. The Latino community, for example, majority impacted here in Fairfax County by COVID-19. On top of that, let's overlay that a portion of it is undocumented. There's already that huge distrust at the federal level with ICE. On top of that, if you take into consideration some of the examples that I shared with you all, and those are just some. They're not even the complete examples of the others that I could share. Those are just some. You can imagine why, for example, the immigrant community does not trust the police, right? That is just one scenario. You are sharing the mechanisms. Fundamentally, for us, the structures are still not working because when Fairfax County comes out and says, well, we have one Fairfax in which we're pointing out towards an equitable and progressive county, our community sees that as just an item. And I'm not going to speak on behalf of all of the Latino community, but I'm speaking on behalf of on the institution that I represent. I think it is critical. Yes, that is one vision to point to, but it is fundamentally not working for a lot of community members. That is why that sentiment is there. That is why we have worked hard, for example, to update the general police orders so that it would diminish any interaction with ICE. That is to rebuild trust. But the conversation is not just trust. I think now we really, for example, I don't think I've even heard the term throughout the whole panel about defunding police. What are we talking about defunding? We're talking about talking about transformation or transferring some of those funds. We haven't hit on some of the items that, yes, to some may be big messaging items, but I do think would have a lot of validity within this conversation. And I'm talking about, for example, legal settlements. We're talking about incentives sometimes for community members not to get into trouble, such as diversion, which I think, for example, it's something really positive to point towards. But at the same time, what incentives are we placing on the police so that there's no misconduct? Are we taking money away and reusing it for mental health purposes? Are we restructuring rather than the 911 calls to address homelessness or somebody having a mental health breakdown? Why are we not sending a mental health professional that they address that? And I think this is also part of the solution. Again, I understand that we're having a conversation about the structures that are already in place, but I do think we definitely need to have that conversation about structures that could replace what we have or redistribute what we already have. And I know that is a challenge. I mean, this is why we have the opportunity at the special session. As far as CASA, we are going to be pushing for some reforms at the state level. But I do think at the local level, we do have that opportunity. And again, I would truly incentivize that we think of more humane and really, if we're using that word equity, really understand that for some of the community members, and again, I share that as somebody who grew up in Colmore, I could be very biased. I could have grown very biased, incredibly biased, but then I wouldn't have been able to work with the chief of police to update those general orders on behalf of my institution. And I think it's very clear that this action, every single interaction with law enforcement, directly impacts what we're living. And so I do want us to have this conversation, about exactly how we can improve this. And I think it's a tough conversation to have, but we should have it.
Thank you, Luis. I think that that's probably this. Hopefully, this session this evening is the first of many that we'll be having with the community, both for One Fairfax, which is misunderstood and not quite. We're not there yet. Quite frankly, we're not there yet. Everybody has their own interpretation of One Fairfax and their own expectations for One Fairfax. Certainly, you had mentioned a couple of things. Yes, COVID-19 has affected persons of color more than many, but it is it doesn't discriminate against anybody, I guess, because lots of people are affected by it. But it does seem that in the areas of, as I recall, at the Council of Governments a couple of months ago, the Prince George's County Health Department director said Americans have very short memories. They're all so surprised that the lower income people and the folks who are persons of color, that they're having problems. Well, this is the way it's always been, he said. It's overcrowding, it's poverty, it's this, it's this. This has always been the challenge. So we shouldn't be so surprised that we're having this problem now. He was absolutely right, but he really said it right out there. Like, no, usually people sort of pussyfoot around it. They don't say it quite that vocally, but I remember very clearly what he had said, and I've used it several times. So we do know that those things are those inequities have existed for a long time. We're making a little progress. We're not making the kinds of progress that we need to make. I will tell you that the police department, when I've talked to officers, you said about the huge distrust with ICE. ICE has been very, very detrimental in more ways than most people see. When the police, our Fairfax County Police, establish some relationships with the community, and then ICE comes in, all the work that they did to build trust with the community, that Fairfax County, sort of gets washed away because ICE comes in, and anybody in a uniform now is suspect. This is very disappointing to police officers who have been working to try and bridge that gap. One of the things also that I wanted to mention, that hiring of police officers is becoming more and more difficult. We have always tried to hire officers that look like our community, and the chief knows that every time we go to a graduation, I count the number of women and the number and kind of diversity that we have in the graduating class. It's getting better, but it's certainly not where it should be. And it is harder and harder to get people to see policing as a career. And that's disappointing because the safety of our community in many ways is going to be at risk if we don't have officers who are committed to the public safety of the community. I just wanted to put that out there, that if people are looking for careers, and they want to do something in the law enforcement field, they shouldn't be put off by the fact we need to have people in our community look at their police officers as, hey, you look like me. I can connect because you look like me. And that's something that we need to continue to work on. It shouldn't be a closed door at all.
So, Supervisor Gross, I still think that there's another element to this that I think we need to be thinking about as a county, and that's the idea that we do need to figure out the mental health component. I mean, police officers shouldn't be a jack of all trades. When if someone's having a mental health crisis, there should be mental health officials that are dealing with them. If someone is having a drug crisis, there should be substance abuse counselors that are the ones tasked with dealing with them. I think the problem is that and I'm going to use an analogy. Some of you may know I spent 6 years in Iraq and dealing very closely with the U.S. military. And one thing I met before this president, I met the last two presidents several times, and one of the things that I mentioned was, we're trying to use the military for all kinds of things, for State Department functions, for USAID functions, for CIA functions, and it just doesn't work, right? Because the military has a mindset and is built for a specific purpose. So the same as our police has a mindset and is built for a particular purpose. And I think that we've tried to ask too much, in trying to figure out. So I'm wondering if there aren't any thoughts from our board as to how we can, work on increasing some of, the other functions within the county, so that the interactions don't necessarily have to be a negative interaction with the police officer. They can be a positive interaction with a mental health person that comes along with the police if they're called out to someone.
Thank you, Saif. Yes, that is something that has been discussed to a certain extent. We've not gotten well into it yet because, again, COVID-19 has reduced our ability to really have those kinds of discussions. The Board of Supervisors, just like Richard said, the Board of Supervisors cannot speak with one another if there are more than two of us in the room at the same time. And so it's very difficult to have those kinds of conversations with you can do two, and then you can do two more, and then you can do two. But we need to be able to have those broader meetings, and we haven't been able to do that. Mental
we can
health.
Do it online so that you're not in the same room.
Well, but even at that, it's not the same as being able to have those sort of side conversations about things that really helps when you're trying to do it all on the screen. It's not the same as the actual being close
Absolutely.
to somebody physically. Certainly, we're seeing more and more mental health issues in the community. It's been exacerbated by COVID-19. I see it in the kinds of emails I get. I hear it in the kinds of phone calls I get. The closer we get to the presidential election, the more it seems to be generated. But there are a lot of people who are just not able. The resilience of our community has been affected by COVID-19 and a lot of other things. And that builds on, there was some general problem anyway, that has been now exposed by COVID-19. So trying to expand we have what we call mobile crisis unit. But the mobile crisis unit is not nearly large enough to address all of the issues and the calls that we get. Diversion First has been very helpful, but that means police officers, take somebody to Woodburn, hand them off, and they can be diverted from the criminal justice system. But that still means it's a police officer. Now, the law may need to be changed. I'm going off on a limb here, but I know that originally the law was, and part of this is state law, in order to go through Diversion First, you had to be, you had to hand them off to somebody in the sheriff's department, as I recall. So the town of Vienna, for instance, has its own police department. They couldn't their officers couldn't do this. They had to be written into the law separately. So you run into all sorts of problems, well, then you can't legally move one person from here to there because you don't have the right personnel to retain custody. So you go, oh my God, what? We had no idea that this was going to be such a problem, but we have to address it. And I think that as we go through more work on diversion first, trying to find more mental health counselors, people who are willing to go out and do the field work rather than just in their offices as counselors. This is going to be a broader piece that we will be able to do in the county as we move through. Right now, we're not there, but certainly we're cognizant of the fact that we could probably mitigate some of the issues by having civilian counselors available instead of expecting the police department, police officers to do everything. You're right. We expect them to be able to do everything, and nobody can do everything. We need to be able to sort of segment it to a certain extent, but also have it integrated to a point where it becomes, in an ideal world, seamless.
I don't want to miss the point on diversion. I think sometimes there is sometimes spaces in which we find agreement and common agreement, and I do think that's something that the audience and folks in Fairfax should strongly support. Not only that, in Virginia, I think we should strongly support localities that are using that type of programs, like diversion, for example, because I know that there are economic disincentives for utilizing strategies such as diversion, or even looking at arrest statistics that happen during the legislature. And so this is something that we also have to transfer to, and I would urge, and that's something that CASA will be doing, but we're obviously just a nonprofit. We're not large enough, but I do believe that whoever has that ability to talk to their state legislature and change that so that localities are incentivized to use this type of programs, because again, the diversion is I think it's incredibly useful that we use that type of program rather than send folks to sending youth most of the time to the justice system. And I think, and again, I really wanted to highlight that point because it is in things like that I think we can definitely make progress. So I wanted to take that opportunity to highlight that.
Thank you, Luis. There's a couple of questions. I just want to make sure that we take some of the people's questions. Mike, I'm sorry if you allow me to do that, just so that people feel like they've gotten questions answered because they've asked. So Richard, on body-worn cameras, when the Commonwealth's attorney reviews the camera footage, what are they reviewing it for? And is it called for data, compiled, used for training, etc., reviewed against the officer's reports?
The first issue, if there's a case that's going to be prosecuted and there is body-worn camera footage, then as Supervisor Gross indicated, not just the incident portion of the body-worn camera footage, but the entirety, however long that might be, has to be reviewed by a Commonwealth attorney to determine whether there's any exculpatory evidence or information within that footage to share with the defense attorney. That's where the cost of the personnel review can become astronomical very quickly. So that's why the requirement for the Commonwealth attorney review when the footage is going to be used in a criminal case. And the second part of the question, I believe, was, is footage reviewed? Yes, the frontline supervisors at each district station are doing random audits of body-worn camera footage for things just as were indicated. If there's a training issue that can be addressed by using an actual incident, they'll use that during roll call at the station or police-wide at the academy. And if there is an incident, I believe that the final part of the question was, is the footage compared to the actual statement? The answer to that is absolutely yes. Not only by the investigator from the police department, but if it's a case that I'm reviewing after the investigation's completed, I review any and all body-worn camera or in-car video footage or any other camera footage, cell phone, surveillance video, whatever.
But it's only reviewed if there's a specific incident. Generally, body-worn camera is only sporadically, or I guess it's chosen reviews by the different districts, is what you're saying?
Yes, and that's a random audit, so that if there is an incident that somebody would rather not become known to his or her supervisor, there's the least of the fear or the risk that it will be picked up in an independent audit or a random audit.
And people ask, why is it hard for families to get a copy of body cam footage when a death occurs during police interactions?
Yeah, I can't really comment on that. That would be a question for the police department. I apologize.
Okay. Mike, you were going to say something before I cut you off. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So I want to challenge some of us tonight to not let what the current status is be good enough, because it's really not that both Richard and the civilian review panel have to turn over what they have to the police. Also, the civilian review panel does not have the authority, it's not within its jurisdiction to review use of force. And that unless there's something different, Supervisor Gross, you can tell me, we don't have good data on police interactions, whether it's stops, whether it's use of force, and the policy changes that need to be made. While our stories are powerful, we need data. So we have to have the data, and Supervisor McKay was talking about it. They've been delinquent or late on it, and continue to push. Early this summer mentioned it. I don't know if that comes in the form of district. Each district provides the data, but there's a lot of information. There's a lot of things that need to be done, and we have to push to how are we going to change the legislation so that the civilian review panel actually has teeth. And so the independent police auditor also, they don't have to just stop and give it back to the police. And unless I don't have it correct, the civilian review panel cannot the scope of what they're able to review is limited and depends on what the police decide to give them. Based on my understanding. And as an attorney, I can say if you're limited on what you get to work with, then that can shape the whole story and paint the entire picture. I just think there's some areas that while we're having this discussion, as we have future discussion, we need to push to improve some things. It's important that we know what we have, but we can't be satisfied, because I'm definitely not satisfied with where things are.
Do you have subpoena authority, Richard? I mean, if you ask for documents from the police department, for example, do they have to provide them?
I don't have subpoena power, but I'm afforded, as is the panel, if there's a request for review made of the panel, or if it's a use of force case that I'm going to be reviewing, I have access to the entire investigation, whatever is included in that investigation. The police department they're not supposed to withhold anything from the investigation from myself or from the panel.
What happens if they do? I know they're not supposed to, but we have to ask that question, right? What happens if they? I mean, and it goes to Mike's question: is what authority? I mean, and is it something that? And maybe this is for Supervisor Gross. Is this something that we need to work on? I guess because of Dillon rule or whatever, with the delegates to make sure that there are authorities to do that.
I don't think the Dillon rule has a doggone thing to do with this.
Okay.
This is what this would be within the purview of the county. What the police department was doing, we made it very clear when we set up the independent police auditor and the civilian review panel. We made it very clear to the police department and to everyone in the police department, but that they had to cooperate and collaborate, and 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 if there was information requested, they were to give it to the independent police auditor and to the review panel. That's the only way you can maintain the integrity of the investigation.
What if they don't?
Well,
Just
You
a
know,
question.
if and I guess I wouldn't know whether they don't unless the independent auditor would say, hey, look, there's got to be more to this, and then we could take some action. But I mean, it does rely on the professionalism and the collaboration that we've set up, and it was very clear. And there were some who did not like that in the department. There are still some officers who are not comfortable with this, but it was very clear this is the way it is being done. This is, and it was, I remember somebody saying, police officer saying, I feel like we're doing things wrong. And I said, no, we're doing things different. And Richard, I don't think I'm not aware. I think that there's enough professionalism and expertise in the civilian review panel that they would pretty much figure out if there was something missing.
yeah, I'll say I've reviewed a lot of their investigations. I've never felt that they've withheld anything from me. But since you've asked a couple of times, if I ever did feel that way, my first avenue would be to go directly to the chief, which clearly I would. Say, if you mentioned you've dealt with him many times, I've got to believe the chief, if I expressed that concern to him, he would take immediate action. I'm typically dealing with his commander over internal affairs, who's a direct report to Chief Rossler. That would be a very serious allegation being made by me. And if the chief and I couldn't resolve it, then I would have no choice. I would go to the Board of Supervisors. And I mean, like myself, the chief is answerable to the board.
Do you understand how, and I've heard some panels and their frustration at what their limitations are. So even though, Richard, you want to do the right things, you'll have the conversations, and if you want to put pressure on them, it still undermines the notion that they can actually move with independence if they can be undercut or undermined in so many ways. And I really heard that frustration from them. And civilian review panel is frustrated on the limitations on what they can do. The community can only lack confidence in what that panel's purpose and function is. If they know that the people who are supposed to be reviewing can't really review it, then to community members, it seems like just one more bureaucratic, window dressing, if you will, to provide visibility that doesn't have the accountability that's necessary. So I hope that in future discussions, or even, I think the civilian review panel was even asking if they could, continue to have public meetings. So if we could have one, and I don't know if they can move around and be hosted by different supervisors, but one where they can hear from the community, because they really do need to hear from the community about things that are going on. And with that, we can craft and shape and strengthen what they're supposed to be doing, or what they feel they should be doing, or what we feel they should be doing. I just think there's just not enough knowledge about them and not enough real power. And if the community does not have power, it's not a real partnership like it should be. We pay the taxes here. We should have more influence in what happens to all the services that are supposed to be provided to us.
Well, I would say if the police review panel feels that there need to be some changes, then they need to get in touch with their appointing authority. The Board of Supervisors appoints members of the police review panel. And quite frankly, I've not heard from any of them about any changes that they would like to have made. So if the review panel wants to make changes, they need to go through the Board of Supervisors and make their case.
I want to understand, you said you heard, I heard a meeting they had on June 25th where they expressly asked Chairman McKay, would he be in support of them expanding their role to have investigative investigatory power, also the jurisdiction to review use of force, serious use of force that right now only Mr. Schott has the ability to do. So I've heard them express a lot of frustration with the limitations of what they can do. So
I will have to look into that with the chairman. That I do not recall that at all. It may have been a conversation they had with the chairman, not with the board.
Okay, so we are reaching the end of our program. Before we wrap up, Supervisor Gross, there's a question that is way off topic that I just want to mention because I promised the individual that I would mention it. Apparently, they're having some issue with the Department of Tax Administration. Who is the right person to reach out to in your office? The tax administrations, including they're a Uber driver, I guess, and their deductions are being.
I am familiar with the case. I spoke with DTA yesterday, and I will be calling this gentleman probably early next week.
Okay, thank you very much. And I want to thank Luis Aguilar of CASA, Mike Woltz of the NAACP Fairfax, the independent police auditor Richard Schott, and our supervisor Penny Gross for joining us this evening, and all of you for joining us and asking questions. I hope that we're going to make this into more of a series where we actually have more meetings about issues like this and community issues so people can get engaged and get involved. Supervisor Gross, is there a way for people to engage with the Public Safety Committee that Supervisor Lusk is chairing right now?
The Public Safety Committee meets at least quarterly. All of those meetings are at this point virtual. Well, actually, they're not all. Sometimes we're all in the same room together, but you can watch it on Channel 16. We generally the committee meetings are not set up to have public testimony, not at this particular point. But they certainly are open to observers, and there have been many times when we were all meeting in person that the room would be full with signs and the whole 9 yards. So yes, you can attend those meetings virtually now, and at some point probably back in person, but there is not usually an opportunity for any public comment. Our agendas are pretty tight, and we have the county folks who are presenting to us, and sometimes non-county folks who are also part of the professional presentation, but not public testimony.
Is there someone in the county staff? Let's say someone has a great idea and they want to help to promote that idea. Is there someone in county staff or your office or Supervisor Lusk's office that people should reach out to so they can present that idea to? I want to give an avenue to people to be able to
if it is has to do with the Public Safety Committee, absolutely you can get in touch with Supervisor Lusk's office directly. Just www.fairfaxcounty.gov, and then you go to Board of Supervisors and his name will pop up. He also, I believe, has instituted a part of his website for ideas. Richard, you may recall what that mechanism is, but I know we talked about it, and he said that he had something on his webpage that would take ideas.
He does. He has a running matrix. Any input from a community member, a county employee, the panel has recommendations on the matrix. He's compiling a very cumulative list of ideas, recommendations, suggestions, and he has ensured people that each and every one will be at least considered.
Well, thank you all. Yes, go ahead, Mike.
Maybe capture the chat and the questions and send to the panels just so we can have it as a record, because especially in this virtual format, it's important that we capture all the feedback that is offered.
So yes, we actually save all of our meetings on our cloud, and you can actually, if you go to the chat, there's 3 dots, and you can actually save the chat on your own computer if you wanted to do that. So that you can do locally, Mike. But we will have that.
Sure that Supervisor Gross and Mr. Schott are able to see it as well, because when we're talking, we're not able to see all the comments.
Yeah, so I will send over to everyone. I'll send over to Mr. Schott and Supervisor Gross the questions that came in, just so that they're aware. But I think we got through the majority of the really important ones. Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I hope, like I said, that this becomes a series so that we actually, continue a conversation as a community, because we all live here. This is where we all want the best for our community, and to work together to accomplish that. Thank you, Supervisor Gross, for the evening, and I'm gonna sign off for the week. Hopefully, for a quiet week at the beach. Thank you for joining us this evening. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
– 2019 was a year of elevation and progress for our Al-Hijrah community. Together, we revamped our mission and vision statement, ensuring that we are working collectively toward a just and virtuous society. As an organization, we diligently amplified the voices of our diverse community within the greater society. With our outreach initiative, Sira Conference, neighborhood visits, revert support, Muslim chaplaincy, and more, we continue to build bridges with our faith communities and organizations in pursuit of social justice and equity. By coordinating with our social service department, we have been able to provide assistance to at-risk communities in Fairfax County. Our annual open house introduces Islam and our community to the general public and combats Islamophobia. Our monthly Solidarity Cup of Tea is geared towards civic engagement. Active Dawah seminars educate the community on how to personally call others to Islam. With your support, these efforts help to maintain our leadership role as a model for other Muslim communities in America. Our public and government affairs programs have positioned Al-Hijrah as an important and effective member for our community and the larger society. Not only were we instrumental in adding Muslim and Jewish holidays to the Fairfax County school calendar, but local politicians look at Al-Hijrah as an ally in Fairfax County.
Last year, I've had an opportunity to attend many events at the center and see that work firsthand. It makes a difference in our community. As we move forward in Virginia and Fairfax County, it's very important that all of our cultures, religions, and people work together to build a better community. Dar Al-Hijrah Islamic Center has played a major role in reaching out to the larger community to make sure that we succeed in creating one Fairfax, a community where people of all cultures can thrive and be healthy.
By hosting candidate forums, we have engaged with officials from local boards, state representatives, the Attorney General, and the Governor to ensure that young first-time offenders are not permanently criminalized. We have championed preschool and after-school programming for all children, and that our state tax dollars are set aside for the security of mosques against the threats of Islamophobia. Through our collaboration work with the Youth Department, we have been able to create an environment for young Muslim professionals to return to the masjid and become active members and mentors to Muslim teenagers. Our goal is to incorporate our values into the social fabric of the wider society. Our accomplishments are many. The responsibilities continue to grow larger every day. It is only with your help and the help of Allah that we can continue to support to build bridges and pursue justice.